Good morning and welcome. I'm Josh Tarini, Senior Clinical Specialist with Medtronic Diabetes, Certified Diabetes Educator, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning, our live webcast, focusing on type 1 diabetes and exercise. We have two esteemed guests this morning, Dr. Bruce Perkins, endocrinologist from Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Mike Rodell, Professor, York University, who are going to deliver some exciting talks and engage us in some case study presentations. We have over 300 people viewing our webcast live across Canada right now, all the way from Newfoundland to British Columbia. I hear we even have one registrant from the Yukon. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Before we get rolling, I'd like to talk to you about the screen in front of you. You should have video on the left side, the slides on the right-hand side, and there's a few little tabs at the bottom that are going to be important for you to know about during our viewing. So you have a Q&A tab where at any time during the webcast, you can submit a question. You just type it in and hit submit. We will be fielding questions for about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the webcast, but please, I would encourage you to submit them at any time. There will be few opportunities to get such expertise to answer those questions and discuss them as this opportunity this morning. There is also another tab in front of you called a resource list. There'll be 4 documents in there. The 2 slide presentations, the case study, and also a fantastic exercise in type 1 resource that Dr. Rodell will tell you about shortly. And the speaker bio tab will be the other tab that you need to know about. So if you want to take a look at the full bios that I'll go through shortly, you have the opportunity to do that as well. So the title of our webcast this morning, Type 1 Diabetes and Exercise, Optimizing the Medtronic MiniMed Veo Insulin Pump and Continuous Glucose Monitoring System for Better Glucose Control for Healthcare Practitioners. Let's take a look at the agenda. So you've heard me do most of the welcome so far. We're going to begin with Dr. Perkins doing a clinical evidence update for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to shift gears. Dr. Mike Rodell will take us through physiology of type 1 diabetes and exercise, also for about 15 minutes. And then collaboratively, our speakers are going to look at some case studies. And finally, for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we will do some questions and discussion. So again, I would encourage you at any time to please go online and submit your questions, and we'll field as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So during and after the webcast, we've got some learning objectives for you today so that you can gain further perspective and understanding of the recent clinical evidence. You can become more proficient in distinguishing patterns in blood glucose data that can help identify challenges in achieving optimal glycemic control before, during, and after exercise, applying strategies that will allow for better glucose control and performance, and finally, to optimize the Medtronic MiniMed Veo Insulin Pump and CGM technology features to achieve better glucose control during exercise. So without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker. Dr. Bruce Perkins is an associate professor and endocrinologist at the University of Toronto and a diabetes complications clinician scientist. He obtained his MD in internal medicine training at the University of Toronto, his endocrinology subspecialty training at Harvard University, his Master's of Public Health in Epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a research fellowship in epidemiology at the Joslin Diabetes Center. Dr. Perkins currently practices at the University of Toronto Leadership Sinai Center for Diabetes at Mount Sinai Hospital here in Toronto. So Dr. Perkins, I'll pass things over to you.
Excellent. Well, Josh, thank you so much, and thank you to Medtronic for involving me in this with my friend Mike. It's actually been a lot of fun preparing for this, and our intention is to really end the session with what we hope are very usable tools and good context for helping people with physical activity. I'd just like to say that we all recognize that someone who's diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they need to truly dedicate themselves to a life of relentless vigilance over blood sugar measurements and insulin dosing and thinking through those doses. And we know that exercise is a normal part of life. And so we realize that exercise just brings out some of the deficiencies that someone might have in an insulin regimen or in their self-management behaviors. But on the other hand, when someone succeeds with exercise, we realize that it's a good marker for the overall success of their diabetes management. So it needs to be a goal that we help all of our patients with. So I'll just start with my dualities of interest. I've accepted speaker fees from a number of insulin producers and pump producers. I've had research support in a few areas from Medtronic and Boehringer Ingelheim, and I sit on an advisory panel or an advisory board for a neuropathy diagnostics company called Neurometrics. So this slide I actually borrowed from Rich Bergenstahl, who's actually the lead author on the ASPIRE study that I'll be talking about in a moment. And I think it really brings a lot to life. So just ignore that left bar. I should have animated that in a moment. But if you look at the rest, you can see that there's a continuous glucose tracing for someone who overnight, you can see even before 2 in the morning, had hypoglycemia, didn't respond to alarms during the night. And actually, this hypoglycemia persisted for hours and ended up in a seizure. It's a seizure that the patient survived. But it was a seizure, so this is a severe hypoglycemic episode. And of course, we put a lot of effort into physiological basal that's going to help control someone's overnight sugars, and ordinarily that person needs a little bit of an increase in their basal at the same time. That would be a typical night. But this night was different. This night, that pre-programmed increase in basal didn't make logical sense in the setting of hypoglycemia. Maybe this was a night where someone had exercised more the night before, or had some alcohol, or had more boluses than they're used to at that time of night. And in an ideal world, it seems that a set of equipment that can measure that glucose and administer insulin should be making some of its decisions on its own to prevent this kind of severe hypoglycemia. So I'm going to talk first about some of these hypoglycemia prevention tools that are new, and I want to speak to the literature around this. I think that the onus is on us to understand this literature very well. I'm just going to briefly go through the 2 key studies that have come up in 2013. So the first is the ASPIRE in-home trial. This is what in Canada we call low glucose suspend, but in the US is being called the threshold-based insulin pump interruption. So the idea, low glucose suspend, when a sensor hits a low threshold, for example 3.9, there can be an algorithm that shuts off basal for 2 hours. It's not a perfect way to treat hypoglycemia, but it, in theory, would help prevent the severity and the duration of that low. The FDA took the stance that we can't say that a sensor value of 3.9 is absolutely, with certainty, a hypoglycemic episode, because the sensors aren't perfectly accurate. That might actually be a sugar of glucose of 4.5. So instead, they've asked for the wording threshold-based, not that it's actually a low glucose. So I hope you understand that little nuance, but it's not so important to understand that, but just realize as you read the literature, it will be referred to as threshold-based or low glucose suspend. So here they took a group of nearly 250 patients. The average patient was in his 40s with long-standing diabetes and an A1C near target, 7.2%, but they excluded people who had recent severe hypoglycemia, and they also had a run-in period that actually excluded in the range of 30% of eligible subjects because they couldn't quite adhere to wearing a sensor for a sufficient amount of time. It was a 3-month randomized intervention and obviously open-labeled because this is a device that we need to acknowledge we're wearing or not. And the primary endpoint for efficacy was the area under the curve for the continuous glucose monitoring trends from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., so overnight. So one group had the sensor-augmented pump with low glucose suspend, or our VAO, and the other group had a standard sensor-augmented pump on a model of pump that's used in the US and not here, but just doesn't have the low glucose suspend, but is a sensor-augmented pump. And so just to give you the findings, on the upper left is the safety measure. So in this study, A1C change over time in each group was considered a safety, not an efficacy parameter, because we weren't looking to improve A1C. We're looking to prevent hypoglycemia. And so we want to make sure that by trying to prevent hypoglycemia, we weren't worsening people's control. And so you can see that the A1C at the start and end in each of the groups was about the same. They were very, very stable. But for efficacy, the area under the curve for nocturnal hypoglycemia, so that's an integrated measure of the duration and severity of hypoglycemia, was reduced by about, or was lower by about 40% in those who were in the threshold suspend group compared to the traditional sensor-augmented pump. And there's many ways we can look at that data, but I feel it's important to also speak to the unexpected finding, which was that the number of hypoglycemic events was decreased by about 30%. So wouldn't you think that, that if the intervention is a trigger when hypoglycemia occurs, that you should have the same amount of hypoglycemia in each group? You should just have shorter duration and you'd hope less severity. But somehow the number of discrete events was substantially decreased by about 30% as well. Actually, Mike, do you know why that would be?
Well, I was thinking about perhaps protecting glucose counterregulation. It may be that if you reduce the number of times you're exposed to hypoglycemia, you might be able to maintain that counterregulatory response, or maybe even restore it. So perhaps they had better glucagon responses, better cortisol responses, and perhaps catecholamine responses early on. Yeah. As glucose was dropping, but I'm not sure.
So the study didn't actually test for that. I guess that could be testable, although it's difficult measuring glucagon and making sense of it. Yeah. But another reason could be that if someone's bound to have recurrent hypoglycemia overnight, that if they have basal off for 2 hours, they're less likely now in the later part of the morning to have a recurrent episode of hypoglycemia as well. But the point is, even holding back that basal didn't mess up people's A1Cs or glycemic control over 3 months. Yeah. All right, but there's another aspect of this study that's important, and that is, well, how much did it mess up people's blood sugars? When the insulin was suspended, in the suspension events, were the following glucoses going up to levels of 15, 20. And here we can see that actually the increase in glucose was very controlled. So 5 at the end of those 2 hours, a mean of 9.4 in the hours following. And there were no DKA events. There were 4 severe hypoglycemic events in the study, but they were in the sensor-augmented pump group without the low glucose suspend, so none occurred in that group. But there's another study that's actually, I would say, as important, maybe more important. So here, this was conducted in Australia. They took about 100 patients who were young, so 18 years old on average, with shorter duration of diabetes, and an A1C that was pretty good as well, at 7.5% on average, on pump. But these people had near total loss of hypoglycemia awareness. So it's used on a scale that basically they've got no more hypoglycemia awareness. And they're considered a very high-risk hypoglycemia group for severe and moderate hypoglycemia. And they were randomized to 6 months of the same threshold suspend strategy versus standard sensor-augmented pump. And here, actually, the data interpretation is a little bit more confusing, but the findings are very convincing. So maybe I'll just guide you through it. So basically here, you see the 50 people on the left column that were randomized to the standard insulin pump with sensor-augmented pump, and then the group with the low glucose suspend on the right. What they did is they evaluated their baseline incidence of hypoglycemia in the 6 months prior. So these are history of severe hypoglycemia, moderate to severe hypoglycemia. So for example, in the group, there was here what's called a failure of randomization. So actually, the group that were in the standard pump group, they had much lower hypoglycemia risk. So they had, in the previous 6 months, 20 events per 100 patient months. So if you took 100 patients and followed them for a month from that group, they would likely have 20 events. So that's not good. But in the other group, there's actually 130 events. So it means that every patient would have at least 1 episode in the next month, and some would have more. So that's their baseline risk. Now they got randomized to be on the threshold suspend or not. And those who got to the threshold suspend, their incidence rate, when it was adjusted for the baseline rate, was substantially lower. So 9.5 events per 100 patients followed for a month compared to 34. So it was 70% lower. It was a big risk reduction. And the average percentage of hours spent in hypoglycemia was substantially lower. So a proportion of the night was 4.4% or 4% instead of 12%. And if you took daytime, it was 4 rather than 7%. So these are pretty convincing findings. It doesn't eradicate hypoglycemia. There's still a need for better tools, but this is one of those tools that we now have in our armamentarium. So who are they important for? I mean, as I was saying at the very beginning, those who are exercising, they are exaggerating problems with their underlying insulin. There's more unpredictability, so that could be a useful tool for them. But let's get into exercise itself and the specific recommendations and kind of management principles that we can do in a clinic visit. So just by context, obviously exercise and sports participation is great. Mike knows this. It helps with being on a team as a child, psychosocial development, modifying our cardiovascular risk factors, being physically fit and not gaining weight, being well conditioned. But it's interesting that interventions that have been tested in randomized clinical trials for exercise don't consistently show that it's great, even though it's our guideline for everyone with diabetes and everyone in society to meet a certain intensity of exercise and amount of exercise per week that Mike's going to talk about. So how do we reconcile this paradox? It's so good, yet when we administer it to people with type 1 diabetes, it messes up their glycemic control. And I think that it comes from putting a bit more thought than the standard thought of just telling someone to exercise who hasn't been active. So let's just a few considerations. How much exercise should we recommend to our patients with diabetes? Mike will speak to that. If we have a man, he's a 70-kilogram man, plans on an intense 1-hour hike on Grouse Mountain without changing his insulin regimen, how much extra carbs would you suggest that he take to avoid hypoglycemia? So I just want you to think about that yourself there at your computer screen. Ask yourself, what would you tell that guy? And then ask yourself also, for those on pump therapy, at what point would you suggest they do a basal change relative to the start of a jog, for example, to help prevent hypoglycemia? So I just want you to ask yourself that question quickly, and I hope you'll kind of get reasonable, workable answers from the next 20 minutes or so. So let's talk about a case. So Jeff is a 28-year-old man who has a 16-year history of type 1 diabetes. He's has been on MDI therapy, but recently changed to a pump. His historical A1Cs have been kind of broad, a bit all over the place, 7 to 8.8%. His cardiac functional inquiry is negative, and he's normotensive, and he has a BMI that would classify as being in the overweight range between 25 and 30. So his is 26. He's made efforts to run and do resistance training in the early morning, but frankly, he just has given up on it because of recurrent hypoglycemia that he's just not able to manage. So to me, what I'd like to go is just through our 5 steps, and actually just yesterday in my clinic, I saw actually a patient from a pediatric group that was asked to see me from Ottawa, and it just reminded me how this little bit of a structured step-by-step approach to help someone think through their exercise can be so helpful. So I'm going to pitch this, even though it's not really evidence-based. We didn't design a protocol and test it and randomize people. It would be a very tough study to do and demonstrate. But to me, the first step is acknowledge and work to reconcile the barriers to effective diabetes management. In other words, you deserve the dignity as a healthcare professional that if you're going to get into this extra stuff, that you've got a patient who's already engaged and kind of doing the work that they need to do for their diabetes to begin with. So that means they've accepted the complexity and demands of day-to-day management, they're adherent to treatment and troubleshooting, they're measuring their blood sugars, we want to identify if there's a lack of social support and access to care. And here I like to really emphasize that if they are involved in physical activity, that they're in an environment that's safe, so that if they have at least some of their teammates, for example, may know they have diabetes and are aware what to do in the setting of problems, that they're not someone who might go on a long run on their own in the early morning without a medical alert bracelet, for example, and if they're part of a running group, at least some people of that group know about their diabetes. There's psychological barriers, and of course, the key thing is how profound is the fear of hypoglycemia, because we can all prevent hypoglycemia before exercise by overdoing the carbs that we eat. So what are the risk factors for developing hypoglycemia unawareness? Because we usually think about hypoglycemia unawareness as a part of like autonomic failure, like an advanced neuropathy or long-standing diabetes where there's been recurrent hypoglycemia and a loss of a reactivity to the catecholamine response in hypoglycemia. But we saw from that Australian study that there were mostly young patients with short duration of diabetes and had total unawareness. So actually, Mike, what do you think are some of the key things that lead to hypoglycemia unawareness, even in someone who's kind of otherwise has uncomplicated diabetes?
Well, we know that with time, certainly this risk increases, but even in patients who are reasonably newly diagnosed, if they're exercising, then they may be at increased risk just in the next 24 hours, this antecedent exercise idea, where something about exercise and the hormones that respond to exercise might cause counter-regulatory failure afterwards. And the same thing with antecedent hypoglycemia, as you've already mentioned. So just that short little window of time in the day before could put you at increased risk, and this autonomic failure seems to snowball with time.
So I put Phil Cryer's citation below. You know, he's done a series of studies where they induce hypoglycemia, and then they look at hypoglycemia over the next 4 hours. If it recurs, the likelihood of not having symptoms is very high. Yeah. And so a patient needs to understand that. If they've got hypoglycemia, they need to understand there's got to be a little bit extra vigilance in these next 4 hours, and you're right, maybe 24 hours. And the same effect of catecholamine rise that gets blunted occurs with a bout of exercise. A bout of exercise is just like a bout of hypo.
There was a recent case study published, in fact, where there was a prospective marathon runner with type 1 who was training and had not had any serious adverse hypoglycemic events in the period up to this big race. But unfortunately, the night before his race, he had a severe hypoglycemic event, required glucagon rescue. And against the advice of his physician, he went out and ran this race. And on the 22nd mile, he dropped with a severe hypoglycemic event, and really didn't have symptoms, didn't have warnings. And maybe the glycogen was low, maybe his counter-regulation was low. So we know it certainly is that window of risk in the hours afterwards.
Yeah, that seems, it kind of seems crazy to me, because I think that the glycogen storage should be sufficient. Like, could giving glucagon deplete the liver of glycogen stores that would be needed the next day? Now, this is someone who's an endurance trainer, so they might be low in glycogen, depending on how well they've done carb loading.
Yeah, we don't know what they ate.
But you know, giving glucagon is like anti-carb loading, isn't it? Because you're releasing stored glycogen, so that could have played a part. Well, I was surprised by these findings. So this is actually from the Aspire in-clinic study. So I showed you the results of the Aspire outpatient study. But in this in-clinic study, what they did is they had people come in for 2 sessions where they intentionally induced hypoglycemia. And they got about 50 people with each of these interventions. So the idea is they induce hypoglycemia, and then they're on that threshold suspend pump, our low glucose suspend, or not. And you can see on this graph, the 2 upper lines are those who had threshold suspend. Their sugars rose nicely into a nice normal range, whereas those who didn't have threshold suspend, they maintained hypoglycemia over hours. But what's interesting is that period 1 means they had hypoglycemia on one day, and period 2 means somewhere about 3 days later or so, they had another induced hypoglycemia. And in the second period, even though their response was good from low glucose suspend, their sugars rose nicely, they didn't rise as much. It gave the impression that maybe because of that hypoglycemia a few days ago, it's somehow blunting this response now. So I mean, the low glucose suspend is still effective with recurrent episodes, as you can see, but not quite as effective for everyone.
And that's interesting, because they both had insulin off during that time, but for one reason, that period 1 group did better, perhaps because of better counter-regulation or better glycogen, or who knows.
Well, the group who did better are those who had the hypo at the start, and then the repeated did worse. And so you'd think it has to have something to do with what happened with the first hypoglycemic event dysregulating the counter-regulation,
Exactly, yeah.
or depleting glycogen stores, or what's another, I thought you had some other idea when we were talking about this, so blunting the counter-regulation, I guess, is one thing, and then depleting glycogen stores
is the other,
Yeah.
and I think they might be working together.
All right, well, what do we do?
It's not effective, though.
Yeah. Anyway, what do we do clinically? Well, we just want to make sure that the active patient has that amount, have they accepted their diabetes? Are they monitoring sufficiently? Because it would be really tough, a lot of potentially unexpected hypos in the patient who's not sort of already doing sufficient monitoring, for example. And of course, the clincher would be being on a sensor to really have a lot more data. So that was step one. Maybe we talked too much about that step. But step two is establish an insulin regimen that's physiological. That is, make sure they have a regimen that doesn't sabotage their efforts to be active. So for example, if someone is on a long-acting analog insulin, like I'm showing in the purple here, maybe their basal's a little bit relatively high to what they would normally have in that gray bar in the early morning hours, but maybe it's fine for the late afternoon. So they should be aware, what basal am I on, and when is it more likely to be at excess or lower, and therefore be more favorable for exercise. So someone getting a nightly injection of a long-acting analog, well, that evening's a pretty good time where they've got lowest level of basals. And of course, with a pump, we can overcome this. But here I'm showing someone's profile. But what if that profile were twice as high or 3 times as high? There are lots of patients at some points of the day, their basal might be set higher because it's not really been thought through or evaluated. So if someone's going to be exercising in the morning, why not evaluate those? And in a case near the end, we'll discuss that. I don't want to go through the things that you know, which is how to evaluate insulin pump parameters. So at this point, while we are, though, evaluating, let's say, basals and their effectiveness of their carb ratio and how good they are at carb counting and all the things that matter in having good day-to-day control, and knowing whether there's some aspect of that that's sabotaging their risk for hypoglycemia, even on a sedentary day. If I'm getting hypoglycemia every morning, even if I'm not exercising, well, it's no big mystery that I might have hypoglycemia when I am exercising. Or maybe I'm not getting hypoglycemia, but my sugar's dropping. And if I identified that, I would know when I'm exercising I'm more likely to drop more severely. So while we're figuring this all out, we understand risk period for lows, engaged in self-monitoring, adhere to consistently timed basal injections if they're on injections. I want to be able to trust my carb ratio, my sensitivity, and that I can troubleshoot highs well. And then I have that healthy exercise environment that if I'd go running with someone like Mike, who's going to be really aware if I'm having hypoglycemia and be ready to support me, rather than someone that I didn't even tell I have diabetes. And then on top of that, and Mike's really good at kind of explaining these, and he will, but we give these simple rule of thumb. After exercise, there can be an adjustment period where a higher sugar normalizes on its own over the next hour or even more. And so we really suggest that people, first of all, don't correct on sugars during the exercise or immediately after. Give it an hour or so unless they're tremendously high. And that if it's after exercise and we're just getting into exercise, let's err on the side of caution and give half correction doses after exercise. And if it's bedtime corrections when we started exercising, also take a half. So if it happens to be at bedtime and right after exercise, we'll just take a quarter of a correction dose and then look at the trend overnight. And you can take the rest of the correction in the morning if we're wrong. But this is a situation where we want to protect against hypoglycemia more intensely. And then for days with exercise in excess of his usual experience, have a bedtime snack that's not covered, decrease basal overnight, that could be the injection or the pump, and then do a 3 a.m. blood glucose check. So for example, there's some judgment here. A marathon trainer might do a longer run each weekend, and so that might be the night where they get the snack and a basal reduction, but then when they actually do their marathon, that would be a snack, basal reduction, and wake up in the middle of the night with an alarm and check a sugar, treat it if it's low. If not, go back to sleep. So now the exercise physiology itself. So I'm just going to give sort of a cursory view for the introduction of my section. We were debating earlier why didn't we have Mike go first and then me, and I kind of prefer this way because we can do is have simple rules of thumb for management, and then we can hear the physiology to put it more in context rather than the other way around. So essentially, when we're exercising, the muscles there on the right, they're increasing glucose disposal into muscle, more glucose going into there. And so what someone without diabetes would do is that the sort of endocrine system, the pancreas, would adjust insulin and glucagon to allow delivery of glucose out of the liver. So basically, less insulin allows more hepatic glucose output, more glucagon allows more hepatic glucose output. So as there's this disposal of glucose into muscle, it's being immediately sensed. It sets up a hormonal environment with lower insulin that the liver can now replace that immediately. And in someone with diabetes who might be on supraphysiological insulin, especially circulating around their muscles, well, the only way to overcome that, if you're not reducing insulin, is to eat more. And so what we want to first think about is what's the order of magnitude of amount of carbs that our muscles want. And so there's been a number of suggestions, this rule of thumb of 15 to 30 grams every 30 to 60 minutes. That was in the ADA guidelines some years ago, where we could use this very quantitative method, which I deliberately made a small chart here. I don't want you to look at the details, but Walsh and Roberts have published around looking at different types of activity and intensities depending on your kind of weight category, how much extra carb your muscles need. These are real overestimates because they're assuming that what they did is they took the caloric demands of running, for example, and as you'll hear from Mike, that we only need about 30 to 50% of our calories while running from carbs, but they're assuming we need 100% of them, so the estimates tend to be quite large. And I think an easier thing is just to estimate, like in your clinic, you can't always be looking up tables, but from work that's been done and summarized by Wasserman and also by Mike, we know that glucose utilization at moderate to high intensity activity, even when ambient insulin's high, kind of for most people tends to plateau out at about 1 gram per kilogram per hour. So our muscles kind of want in the ballpark of a maximum of 1 gram per kilogram of our weight per hour of moderate to high intensity activity. And we find that at that maximum, for most people that we're advising to get into exercise, it's more like the 0.5 gram that makes sense. Sure, there are these elite athletes whose muscles are taking up a lot more than that per hour, but that's not the patient we're getting into exercise. They've been training. We're talking about recommendations to get people into it.
And if you just go back if you don't mind, just for one quick second. What I like about this, it shows that the higher the insulin that's on board is going to influence how much glucose your muscles are taking up, which gets back to the timing of when you want to exercise.
Actually, it's a very good point. Like that, when someone with diabetes exercises, it's worth thinking, what's the active insulin on board? How long ago was the last bolus? Do I really know about my basal and its rates at this time of day? All right, so this Jeff that we were talking about, he could eat more. So he weighs 80 kilos, so 0.5 gram per kilogram would be 40 grams per hour of moderate to intense aerobic activity. Now, if he were to run for 4 hours, that would be 160 grams. I'm not sure how to advise each hour, but philosophically, we want to get people into their first hour. Like, for example, we were on a trip in Kilimanjaro with a group of people with diabetes, and we just focused on people getting into their first hour or two with a strategy and then using their blood sugars to titrate what they do. But certainly have on you for that activity, based on this calculation, 40 grams per hour. So if you're going for a 3-hour run, we better make sure you have at least 120 grams of carbs on you. Otherwise, you're not prepared for that run.
Yeah, you don't have to use it all, but at least it's there if you need it.
Yeah, get through your first hour, take the 40 grams. So he could take, for example, a bottle of most sports drinks has about 15 grams per cup, and there's about 3 cups in there, so that's 45 grams. So if you ran the first hour, taking in this rapid absorbing carb through the hour, that would help counteract insulin. It's not eating 4 slices of pizza or a milkshake. It's 40 grams of carbs as a rapid absorbing carb. Right. And then now we can educate the patient about translating X carbs into insulin dose adjustments. So here, this is actually the same point that I just made about X carbs. But if someone's going to be exercising after a meal. And so generally in the 90 minutes after that meal, in that ballpark, like within the 90 minutes, you may as well reduce the insulin in that meal. So if someone's going to eat 90 grams of carbs, but their muscles, free of the effect of insulin, need 40 grams as extra carbs for exercise, then you could bolus for just 50. It's like having a 50-gram meal and a 40-gram snack mixed into it. But here the idea is that someone gets a concept of how much carbs the muscles need, and therefore how much insulin to reduce for that meal before the exercise. You know, we used to say, well, cut the bolus in half. If someone's having a meal that has 10 grams of carbs, well, that's only 5 grams of extra carbs for their exercise. And if someone's eating a 200-gram meal and they cut it in half, well, that's giving an extra 100 grams for exercise. So I like the idea that the pump patient is generally an educated patient around carb counting. So if you see them, you could think to yourself, well, how much do they weigh? Half a gram is roughly 40 grams. You could say, make sure you've got that extra grams in you for the first hour of exercise, or reduce your bolus by that much for a meal before. And then the next part of adjusting insulin, and this one actually, when I speak with athletes and people who exercise a lot, this is one of those aha moments around diabetes management. So what this was is a study from the DirectNet study group. So in kids, about 50 kids who were on a treadmill for an hour, and on one day they just exercised with their pump on and getting basal, and the other day they suspended at the start of exercise until after the exercise. And so you can see the lower line is the day that they wore the pump through the exercise and got their basal. They dropped during the exercise and then came back up to where they were beforehand. So what you're seeing is an interquartile range, is other quarter of people are well into the low range. And you can see that if they disconnected their pump at the start, they didn't get as much lows. You can see the distribution's a bit higher. But what kills me is that they still dropped over the exercise, and dropped quite a bit. Because again, that's an interquartile range. There's lots of people who had lows. And then on top of that, they rose afterwards, but they rose a lot. You can see the distribution in that last plot is very wide. So in my mind, the problem here is that at the moment they start exercising, if they didn't have diabetes, they would start to decrease their insulin. Maybe not at the very moment, but soon after the start. Someone without diabetes would lower insulin in the blood. But here, because of the dynamics of subcutaneous insulin, it goes under the skin. It takes 60 to 90 minutes to peak. It means the moment before they disconnected, that insulin is going to peak the same way it would over the duration of that whole activity. In other words, during that hour of activity, they're essentially getting the same kind of basal as they would if they hadn't disconnected. And then on top of that, during the hour of exercise where they're getting absolutely no basal insulin, now 60 to 90 minutes later, when they're recovering and they're needing insulin to control their sugar, no basal insulin is entering the blood, so then they get that big rebound. So to me, the obvious solution is not to cut off basal altogether. So for example, we could cut it in half through the run, but that we need to start an hour and a half before, so that the moment they start running, there's less insulin entering the blood from the subcutaneous space. So someone, for planned exercise, an hour and a half before the exercise, could set a temporary basal for an hour and a half plus the duration. So this person would set it for 2.5 hours, starting an hour and a half before the exercise. And then maybe what I've said, sometimes patients interpret that you've got to wear the pump. The advice is wear the pump, and that kind of generally is my advice. But to me, right when you disconnect, you could give half of the next hour's basal. So if they're getting 0.8 units an hour and they're going to get 0.4, at the start of the run, they could just bolus 0.4 units, and that basically fills in the next hour. Or frankly, they could even give that little bolus at the end of that 1 hour. So I think that we can disconnect and be free of our pump and activity if we want. Better to keep it on, but what's the big deal to give that hour's basal as a little bolus and be disconnected?
I wanted to ask you a question, if you don't mind, on that last slide, in your opinion.
Sure.
About turning that basal rate back to normal. We saw on the one graph that glucose was starting to climb, and as soon as they finished exercise, do you advise your patients to get the basal rate back up as soon as I finish exercise? We do have some case studies near the end that talk about
Yeah, so by having the basal cut in half, I think it's starting to get the basal up after the exercise, because now at the very end of exercise it goes up to 100%.
Yeah.
But we have found that some people, what we do is we, after they have some experience with that and we see these rises, we can bring it back to the full basal earlier.
Even earlier,
for example, during the run, they're 30 minutes in, well, it starts giving the usual basal, so now in the next hour, it's going to be coming up. It's not going to come up during their run, because it still takes time to absorb.
Yeah.
But the idea is you can restore that full basal earlier.
Good.
But this is a great way to get people started. And then we need to educate patients about the effects of anaerobic and resistance exercise. This is definitely Mike's expertise, but the idea is if someone does aerobic exercise, they make a lot of catecholamines. Anyone with diabetes can go really, really high intensity activity and not really need so much of a reduction in insulin. What they need is to control the effects of the adrenaline surge during the exercise. So someone without diabetes would spike their insulin right afterwards. And here what we've done is mostly removed insulin. So my advice on this front is to assume all activity first is like aerobic. Reduce the insulin, add the X carbs. But then if that activity is the type that fits with the style of anaerobic resistance, like high intensity sprinting, high weightlifting to maximal reps, and
short distance rowing like Chris there.
Yeah, exactly. Those are ones where we would start after we do a bout or two of exercise and confirm to ourselves that our sugars are rising. Then we can take away some of the extra carbs we're eating and restore some of the insulin that we've removed bit by bit. So if we're taking 40 grams of X carbs, well, the next time maybe it's 20 grams if we've seen that rise.
Yeah.
And not be surprised if it's anaerobic style exercise. The reason I kind of insist on this is that there's lots of people who play hockey, for example, and you don't really know whether that activity is going to be more aerobic, lots of skating around, or more anaerobic. So get some experience, go through the punishment of a few highs, and then adjust back up the insulin and down the extra carbs. And in fact, we can use anaerobic exercise to our benefit. This was a study where they did a 10-second all-out sprint after a cycle ergometer, and when they did it, maintained their sugar better than when they didn't. In fact, this study is one that Mike and I were involved in. Jane Yardley published on this. What it's showing in the black bar is people doing resistance exercise first for 45 minutes and then aerobic exercise second. So you can see it drops during aerobic, but not as much as if they did aerobic first, which is in the dotted line, and then resistance afterwards. So you kind of get a little bit more control by teeing up your system with a little more adrenaline from the resistance exercise before the aerobic. So for people who do combined exercise, this suggests that maybe doing resistance first helps. But on top of that, if they did resistance first in this black line in the overnight blood sugars, they got less of that dip overnight than if they did aerobic first. So those were very interesting findings.
Yeah, and that study actually changed the way that I now tackle my exercise. I like to do that resistance first, and then I feel much more protected during the aerobic.
All right, so I think I've gone a little bit over time, haven't I? So I'm going to summarize, because I wanted this to be simple. Think about when I meet with a patient, they want advice around exercise, think of 5 steps, and I would recommend this to any educator or dietitian. First is, the work that we all do, identify and reconcile existing barriers to effective care. Secondly, at least try and evaluate if there are problems with their insulin regimen to begin with, even on a sedentary day, by doing things like evaluating basals or their carb ratios up to snuff. Third, coach the patient to estimate X carbs, or just tell them that value, 0.5 gram per kilogram of their weight for the first hour. Fourth, coach the patient to adjust insulin. If there's bolus on board, like after a meal, subtract the X carbs from the meal bolus. And if it's exercise without bolus on board, and even if it is, we can do this basal reduction as an extra countermeasure to hypoglycemia during and after exercise. And then finally, educate the patient about the effects of anaerobic and resistance exercise, where we'd now work in the opposite direction to bring back up the insulin or down the extra carbs. Oh, I had these nice little symbols to guide me through it that I forgot to use as the reminders. So how much exercise should we recommend to our patients with diabetes? More on this in a moment. A 70-kilogram man plans on an hour hike, so half a gram per kilogram. That would be 35 grams of X-carbs through that hour of exercise. And then for those on insulin pump therapy, we'd suggest a basal insulin reduction, not completely suspending, but a reduction an hour and a half before until the end of the exercise. So I just want to take a moment because there are people from all over Canada. We are looking for people all over Canada who have 50 years or more of type 1 diabetes. If you would each think of 1 or 2 people in your practice at the moment and connect them with this website or that toll-free number, I'd be so grateful. We have a few more months to accrue patients. We're just over 200 of our 300 people. We have beautiful stories about those with long-standing diabetes across Canada. This first phase of the study is just a questionnaire that we administer to them. So please, we would love you getting the word out about this study in the last months of it. All right.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Perkins, for that excellent review of the clinical evidence and also the 5-step management protocol for exercise. So moving along, we'll now pass things over to Dr. Mike Riddell, who I will introduce now. So Dr. Riddell comes to us from York University. He's a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Science and Muscle Health Research Center. Dr. Riddell has conducted numerous studies over the past 2 decades on the metabolic and hormonal responses to exercise and stress in diabetes. He's the founder and director of the Diabetes Sports Camp at York University, which helps young people with type 1 diabetes improve their sports performance and their blood glucose control. Dr. Riddell is also the director of education for D-Skate, a wonderful program that combines hockey and diabetes education for youths living with type 1 diabetes. So I will now turn things over to Dr. Riddell to carry on.
Thanks, Josh. And here are my disclosures. I'll also disclose that I'm one of Dr. Perkins' patients and have been for about 10 years now, and I enjoy working together on these problems of exercise. I think most of us know why we need to exercise, whether we have diabetes or not. It's certainly important for our fitness, for our quality of life. If we have diabetes, either type 1 or type 2, it makes the insulin work better, improves blood pressure, lipid levels. There's some evidence that it can even increase longevity, at least in cross-sectional studies. But the real challenge for those of us with type 1 is does it really improve our blood sugar control or not? And in fact, we'll learn that it's just one more variable that makes management challenging. Now, I was asked to speak just briefly on the new Canadian Diabetes Association guidelines on how much exercise our patient population should be doing. Well, they should be doing about 150 minutes per week of accumulated activity. It doesn't have to be structured activity. It doesn't have to be structured exercise. But overall, we should be aiming for about an hour a day. And we should be incorporating resistance training in our protocols now. And Bruce talked a little bit about some of the advantages of doing your resistance before aerobic. We like to recommend that patients are doing about 2 days of resistance-based exercise, using the large muscle groups. And that's been shown, at least in patients with type 2, to improve hemoglobin A1C. In type 1, the jury's still out on whether it'll improve hemoglobin A1C. There's some work being done right now to see if resistance and aerobic combined might be helpful. It does have some advantages with respect to blood sugar stability, which Bruce already talked about. Well, the sad thing is that very few of us as Canadians are achieving this minimum guideline. About 1/3 of us are getting this 100 minutes per week, and 150 minutes per week. And if you look at the diabetes population, in general, their engagement in activity is even less than in the non-diabetic population. If you look at cross-sectionally in children with type 1, and you look at a large cohort of European children with type 1, and you break them up into quartiles for how much exercise they do. So the first quartile are only doing 0 to 2 hours of exercise per week. The second quartile is doing about 2 to 4. The third quartile is about 4 to 6. And the fourth quartile is the one that's just achieving those minimum guidelines. And you can see that the level of hemoglobin A1C on the y-axis is actually the worst in the group that's doing the most physical activity, these kids with type 1. And that's concerning. I think that it's a real challenge for these kids to stay under good metabolic control. They're always fearful of low blood sugar when they play sports, when they're engaged in recess. And that's something we have to do better on, I think, as healthcare providers. So try to get that A1C down. Of course, these are mostly MDI users, and we now know that if you're using a pump and even a sensor-augmented pump, you can compete quite competitively and have a very good hemoglobin A1C. Now, Bruce already mentioned about the challenges of blood sugar stability, but I find it quite shocking when I learned for the first time that we're only carrying about 4 grams of sugar in our bloodstream at any one point in time. If, for example, you take a 50-kilogram child, that's around 4 liters of blood that they have in their body, or 40 deciliters. And if you multiply that by a normal blood sugar of around 5.5 or 5.6 millimoles, that's only 40 grams of sugar. So no wonder when they step on the hockey rink or they hop on their bike, that 4 grams can change quite rapidly. Bruce talked about how you're using maybe a gram per kg per minute. So you can certainly cause that glucose either to go up or go down. And what we see is that in most cases, exercise is acting like insulin, and we tell our patients that exercise makes insulin more efficient, exercise is like insulin, and you have to balance it with the right amount of food or lower your insulin. But in some cases, we're seeing that exercise is acting like food because it's so intense, the catecholamines are rising, and we need to sometimes counter with a little bit more insulin, at least in early recovery, to bring sugars back into balance. Now, we like to illustrate schematically the balance between glucose production by liver and skeletal muscle during exercise. And we use this schematic to try to illustrate the mechanisms for why sometimes you go low when you exercise and sometimes you go high. So on the top panel, what we're trying to mimic in that patient who has diabetes is something that looks exactly like what happens in non-diabetics when they exercise. And that's as soon as they begin to exercise, the insulin release from the beta cell right into the portal circulation, it drops. Whereas hormones like glucagon, cortisol, growth hormone, they rise gradually. And that keeps glucose production by the liver mimicking exactly how much glucose is being taken up by the skeletal muscle. You see that the arrows there are about the same thickness. And they can exercise for 2 hours without taking any snacks, really. If they don't have diabetes, then they'll have complete euglycemia. What we often see is that when that individual with type 1 begins to exercise, they're kind of over-insulinized. They don't have the capacity to downregulate insulin release from beta cells. And in doing so, they're limiting glucose production by the liver. Sometimes that glucose, or that high insulin level, perhaps just after a meal, is facilitating more glucose disposal into muscle. And it's even possible that glucose is going into muscle that's not exercising and being converted into lipid. We know that glucose disposal is very high when the patient is over-insulinized. Now, if you look at the lower panel, in some occasions, perhaps exercise in the heat, exercise in a very strenuous game where there's a lot of competition stress, we'll see a secretion of catecholamines. And that increase in catecholamines is not balanced by a rise in insulin, and you'll see excessive glucose production by the liver. And interestingly enough, that rise in catecholamines has been shown to lower glucose disposal into muscle. And that's maybe why a sprint-based activity might cause blood sugar to go up or prevent it from dropping because of these rises in catecholamines.
What kills me about this slide is that we published that paper 8 years ago.
Yeah, and
can you believe that?
And we still get a lot of requests to explain this paper and to get it out to the population, because I think patients themselves can better understand the physiology if they look at a simple schematic like this. So this graphic shows the different types of activities that we all do, or that kids with type 1 diabetes do. And the activities that are on the top, they're more anaerobic in nature. We do them for very short periods of time. For example, a quick game of tag or weightlifting or sprinting. The duration is not that long, and they're associated with high catecholamines. And if we just do these exclusively, we might see a rise in blood sugar levels during that type of activity. The activities on the bottom are purely aerobic. We tend to do them for maybe an hour or maybe even 2 hours. And of course, with this aerobic exercise, we often see low blood sugar. Now, I like the activities in the middle. I think they're the ones that haven't been studied very much in the lab, but I know anecdotally that they're the activities that are associated with more blood sugar stability. Sometimes you're sprinting and bursts of activity, you're getting a surge of catecholamines, and maybe that's helping to prevent that drop in glycemia. So these are the activities that I think those of us with diabetes who are worried about big glucose excursions, they should be the ones that we're targeting. All right, let's talk a little bit about the activities on the bottom, the aerobic activities. Now, aerobic exercise, it's incredible how much total carbohydrate the body can oxidize. Now, Bruce talked a little bit about glucose disposal being up to maybe 1 gram per kg, but if you look at also the muscle glycogen that's being oxidized, and the liver glycogen, and the blood sugar, you can get as high as 1.5 grams per kg per mass per hour. So in someone of our weight, that could be maybe 150 grams of carbohydrate in an hour's worth of exercise. Now, you'd never want to consume that. You'd have gastric upset, and it would be far too much carbohydrate because, of course, your body can still use muscle glycogen as a fuel if you have diabetes. So this value of 1.5 grams per kg is total carbohydrate utilization, but it reminds us that if we're an athlete, if we're doing exercise vigorously, we do need to have lots of carb in our diet. Now, Josh, with your nutrition background, you know that some people are on a low carbohydrate diet, but we keep having to remind them that your body's using carbs with exercise and it needs to be replenished. Maybe some during and then some in recovery. For moderate exercise, it's about 1 gram per kg, and for mild exercise, it's about ½ gram. You know, many of our patients, they understand carb counting in foods, but I think we need to get them carb counting for exercise so that they know how to eat better and have better glucose stability. Now, some important studies have been published not that long ago showing that you really can't absorb much more than about 60 grams an hour from your gastrointestinal system when you're exercising. When you're exercising, blood flow to the gut goes down a little bit, and even if you take simple carbohydrates, you really can't absorb more than about 60 grams per hour. So this is kind of the upper limit of what we would prescribe for an athlete with diabetes if they were really struggling with low blood sugar. And we've got a case study in which one of our participants consumed about 140 grams, and you can see what happens to his blood sugar in recovery. Now, this graphic here shows a group of type 1 individuals on a sedentary day and on an exercise day. The black line is their blood sugar measurements during a regular sedentary day. And the green line is what happens when they did a 45-minute spin class. We all did this study together, in fact, as investigators and also as participants. I don't know if you remember this study, Bruce. But
all too well, unfortunately.
But it was really quite startling. We were exercising with just basal insulin on board. It was about 4 hours after lunch. And you can see that green line, that precipitous drop in our blood sugar levels, with some of us becoming hypoglycemic by the end of this spin class. What I like about this graphic is it shows what happens in recovery. So we haven't adjusted our basal insulin. We've stopped our exercise, and you can see that there's this rebound effect. And sure, maybe some of that rebound effect is we like to eat in recovery. There's our dinner show in there. And then we have this third phenomenon that needs to be addressed, and that's that nocturnal hypoglycemia, that it seems to occur around 7 to 11 hours after the exercise. So Bruce has talked a little bit about some of the clinical strategies to prevent that drop with early basal reductions, how to limit that rise in early recovery by getting basal back up, and making sure we're using the full carb counting and insulin for that carb in recovery, hopefully. And then hopefully getting to bed with a pretty normal blood sugar levels, but needing some sort of adjustment at bedtime. And in this study, this was blinded CGM, so we didn't have a real-time sensor to warn us of low blood sugar, but we could see retrospectively that this was a problem area. And subsequent studies have been shown to show that you need to reduce that basal rate by about 20 to 25% at bedtime for about 6 hours to help prevent this. I don't know if you have any comments about this study, if you remember it fondly.
Yeah, I mean, what I noticed is that you were saying that the drop is 7 hours or more, but there's later. But it just seems to be, in any studies we've done this, there's this 2 to 3 a.m. dip that's, I don't know what it's all about. It might be preceding the dawn phenomenon, just preceding it, where there's more catecholamines and there's a little drop before. I don't know how to explain it, but it's something we see repeatedly, and it's that time of night that creates a risk period for people, doesn't it?
And that's why you're recommending, if they're not on sensors, to have an alarm set to do that check at 3 a.m., particularly if this is a new activity that they're unaccustomed to. This is just an overall cartoon schematic about the role of catecholamines when we're doing intense exercise. And the drive of catecholamines is really coming from the central nervous system, and it's increasing maybe 16-fold in the blood circulation, the catecholamines. And that's raising glucose production maybe 7-8-fold. And this activity may be just very brief in nature. And in fact, those catecholamines are limiting glucose uptake. It's only rising maybe 3 to 4-fold. And you often see this rise in blood sugar. Now, for me, Bruce, I don't like to bolus insulin before I do an intense sprint. I don't know if you recommend that to your patients, but I certainly look in early recovery to see if I need a correction for this type of rise in glycemia associated with sprint-based activities.
I just warn against those corrections early after exercise, because often there's an amount of correction that happens on its own, muscle recovery of glucose to form glycogen.
Yeah.
So we usually ask that it's a good hour after an activity before giving full correction doses.
Right, maybe the next meal, an hour or so after, do you need a correction? And you can easily put that into your pump and it's going to correct. And some people will be conservative with that correction if it's at bedtime. They'll take a little less.
Exactly.
All right, so I'll just show you some data that we've collected over the last year or so on young hockey players. There hasn't been much published yet on hockey players, but with DSCADE and with the capacity to use now CGM in youth hockey players, we have learned some things. For example, in this one child, we put a blinded glucose sensor on. You can see the little heart-shaped symbols illustrating when he was in this hockey tournament. I think it was a couple of games. Maybe there was a practice warm-up, a game, and then a practice afterwards. And you can see that he did have this kind of gradual rise in blood sugar levels during the game. He was a little bit elevated in the hour or two afterwards, but then it seemed to normalize. So like Bruce said, for this particular patient, he didn't require that correction.
So we're not sure where he finished the exercise. It might have been at noon, and it's sort of that hour after that there's that most of the recovery.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be longer, but we don't want to. I'd be afraid, had he taken a correction at the peak there at noon, that could have led to hypoglycemia.
Right, and we often ask, parents are saying, he comes off the ice, he's 15, what should I do? And that's kind of that cut point, isn't it? If they're 22, you can understand a correction, a conservative one. But if they're only 11 or 15, maybe just leave it for the hour or so.
And as we get into this, before there's experience with it, half correction,
right,
or maybe even less.
Exactly. Now, this is a child that did do a correction at bedtime. So he performed hockey later in the evening, which is when a lot of these young players will play. They'll play after school, they'll play in the evening. And you can see, again, the blood sugar rise during hockey. And then they did a correction, and he wore this blinded sensor overnight. And you can definitely see he ran into trouble. The mom didn't want him to go to bed with a blood sugar of 15. They did the correction and then had that nocturnal episode.
Yeah. I think it illustrates the same point, the correction right after hockey when it was 15, as opposed to a correction an hour later when it was actually 9 or 10, would potentially give a different story. So there's that immediate correction. In other words, there's that rise with the catecholamine surge that attenuates to some degree in the short term.
And then the muscle and the liver is taking up that glucose in recovery and doesn't need to have all that extra insulin. We are insulin sensitive. And again, note that he's hypoglycemic between that 2 and 4 a.m. window, just like we see repeatedly. I've got a couple of tracings from a bike race that we did last April. And this is a race that Bruce was in, I was in, a couple of other good friends with type 1 diabetes. And from the help of Medtronic, we had some glucose sensors. Some of them were blinded sensors for the MDI patients, and some of them were real-time sensors. So I'll just share. This is a very fun race, by the way. It's 90 kilometers in this early spring, mud, sleet, freezing cold. And it's a real challenge of not only your cycling capacity, but also your diabetes management.
Mike said it was fun. I did not say it was fun.
We've done it 4 years in a row, so there's something fun about it. So on the top tracing here, well, actually, this whole page is 2 patients who are on MDI therapy. The top tracing in purple, the descriptor for him is on the right. So he's a male. He has type 1 for only 4 years. He was diagnosed a little bit later in life, in the mid-40s. And he's an MDI patient taking 18 units of glargine at bedtime. And he reduced this glargine the night before this bike race by a third, which I think was quite reasonable. He woke up at 5 a.m. Or 6 a.m. with a blood sugar of 5.8, which is excellent. He had 90 grams of carb pre-race, and that carb could get absorbed into his system and be ready for the race. You can see maybe he's a little bit high at 12 millimoles just before the race, but you're excited about the race. You've lowered the basal insulin, so that's expected.
And it was a postprandial level, too.
Yeah,
right?
so it's reasonable.
Grams, yeah.
So you can see there during this, for him, about almost a 3.5, 4 hour ride, you can see that he's taking X carbs. Those little arrows are indicating that he's taking X carbs. He's snacking through this. He had about 60 grams over the whole 2 hours, so not excessive carb intake. He was eating things like raisins and and Cliff Bars, things that were reasonably rapidly absorbed, but not quick carbs by any means. And then he had that post-race meal. And his blood sugar really was quite impressive for an MDI patient.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Now look at the one on the bottom though. This is more typical of what you see. A blood sugar that is already very high. This guy's had type 1 for 5 years. He's a very good cyclist in his 20s. He took 28 units of glargine at bedtime. He woke up at 11.2 millimoles, which is a little bit high, but we see it all the time. Now this is what he had for breakfast. A bag of peanuts that had M&Ms in it, and a half a Cliff Bar. And his blood sugar is quite high. You can see 18. And he starts the race, and his blood sugar goes up. Now we know that if your blood sugar is over 17 and you're producing ketones, it can be quite dangerous to bike. And luckily, he felt lousy, so he stopped, confirmed his sugar, because he couldn't see the sensor readings, a blinded CGM, and he bolused insulin. Which is nerve-wracking. I remember passing him on the race, seeing him drawing up a dirty syringe in the mud, injecting insulin, and then back on the bike. And he has to do it again. You see 2 asterisks there. Luckily, he did not have a severe low, though, and he finished the race in very good shape. But then again, you see this rebound hyperglycemia, which often occurs the meal afterwards. Any comments about these 2 MDI patients?
So had this one also cut back basal insulin the night before?
No, he hadn't changed his basal insulin from what was traditional.
Okay.
I think he could be optimized a little bit as a patient for his strategy because he's waking up quite high in a fasted state.
Yeah. I mean, the main warning is that if you cut back injected basal at bedtime, you're helping reduce the overnight insulin, but also the most substantially lower basal will be in the afternoon when that basal is running out. And so you can see these big escapes, like in the blue. The guy in the purple did well regardless.
Yeah.
He did a basal reduction.
I would argue that maybe he's still got some residual islet function. Who knows? This is an interesting diagnosis, but we don't know for certain.
Sure.
Okay, let's look at our continuous, our pump users. We've got one success story on the bottom there in yellow and one that was real challenging. I just wanted to share with you that sometimes even if you have a pump and experience, it can be a challenge. Now this fellow woke up with a slightly high sugar, and he did his basal rate reduction. I think it was around a 25% basal rate reduction an hour before exercise, which is reasonable. But he normally has a pre-race snack. And unfortunately, he had a mechanical problem on his bike. So he forgot to do his pre-race snack. He hopped on the bike, and he started the race. And you could see this precipitous drop in his blood sugar. And he knew he was going low, but he was treating with the wrong carbohydrate. He was treating with Cliff Bars, energy bars, granola bars. And when you're pedaling that hard, your circulation to the gastrointestinal system is pretty low. You need to have a rapid-acting carb, and he didn't do that. And then he finishes the race after having to take a couple breaks. Unfortunately, he had to stop cycling, but finishes the race, and then his blood sugar shoots up because now he's probably absorbing all that extra carb and those insulin adjustments that he's had. Now, this is actually Bruce's tracing on the bottom. So why don't you tell us how you had such a success in this particular race?
Is that right? Oh, jeez. Well, listen, just for the red one to begin with, it looks like there may have been a correction before. There's active insulin on board during the race, and then there's no X carbs, even though there was a minor basal reduction. So, some of the concepts were missing. In this case, there was basal rate reduction before down to 40%. So it went. That was an hour and a half before instead of 50, but that ballpark. And then there was the X carbs that were in the range of 0.5 gram per kilogram per hour. So I think, just having those things in that ballpark gives you a better chance at success. That tracing actually looks really good to me. I'm a little surprised it's me. And it doesn't have to be this perfect. And later in the day there were some higher sugars, and control doesn't have to be perfect then either, because we want to anticipate the delayed effect into the evening and night as well.
What I noticed about your tracing is that you've got lots of little boluses in recovery and making sure that glucose is down. I think that really is one of the advantages of being able to do really small dosages in this pump and then seeing the tracing right there. But
in reality, you have us over to your place afterwards.
We eat a lot,
comes, we're eating, and yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, just to summarize, because we want to leave some time for questions and a few more case studies. We know that metabolic control may be compromised. Even in those who are the most active, they may have the worst control. And I think that we need to do better with these patients by getting them on maybe sensor-augmented pumps and educating them more about the physiology. The adjustments that we are doing are dependent on a number of factors: the intensity of exercise, the temporal time of exercise related to the last meal. So there's a lot of variables that we need to think about, and the duration of the activity. We can think a bit about warm-up with resistance or sprint-based training and then doing aerobics. And I'd like you to remind ourselves that for prolonged exercise, we really need to have rapid-acting carbs, in my opinion. You can have those long-acting carbs maybe before the exercise, but during the race, it's good to have these rapid-acting carbs to help get that glucose into the circulation when we need it most. And I think that your tracing and some of the other tracings we have from the study shows that flexibility in a real-time sensor-augmented pump has advantages for early recovery in particular. There is an online resource. It's something that we've put together. This is for patients. In essence, you can find this at the Webcast. You can download it, and thanks to Medtronic for helping print this up. We've got a book coming out in the next 6 months or so that's also for patients to help with their managers around sport. And I'll hand it back to Bruce for some more clinical discussions.
All right. So there's 20 minutes left. How many minutes do we want at the end of the last case
Well, I
left?
think we were thinking for about 10 minutes for questions, but we'll see as they flow in from the audience, and we can proceed accordingly.
All right. So we've seen some cases around acute changes in exercise. These cases I wanted to bring up for a few reasons. One is to evaluate the pump parameters even for a sedentary day. So remember step 2, which was make sure insulin regimen seems in the ballpark of physiological insulin. And the second purpose is to kind of go through some of the CareLink Pro outputs, their appearance and interpreting them. So we'll go to this case actually that we were discussing. Remember, he was doing the early morning runs and having hypoglycemia into the run repeatedly enough that he just kind of gave up. So for him, the first thing that I like to see on an output, even though I'm going to show you a kind of a summarized approach in another case in a moment, I like to just see at face value, what are their insulin pump parameters? I need to consider what they are. So on the left side, we see the basal profile. And what I look for is kind of a qualitatively higher basal rate in the dawn phenomenon hours, which to me are in the range of 3 to 9 a.m. And then from noon to 5, I look for a lower level. So I tend to, in our practice, we tend to kind of program midnight, 3, 9, noon, 5. Those are the important times, so that 3 to 9 are high, noon to 5 are relatively lower, and the hours in between, morning and evening, and into the early part from midnight to 3, in between. And you see by this person's that they're kind of flat. So either he's got too little overnight dawn phenomenon and then too much afternoon basal because they're very flat through the whole day, or he's got the right amount of the right amount of daytime basal but not enough overnight. So it's one of these situations that I would just look for. Is he struggling with morning blood sugar control or with afternoon lows? And then on the other side, the lower right, we have the carb ratio profile. I feel when people have physiological basal, they tend to need roughly the same carb ratio. And they're roughly the same, although 5, 6, 7, you can see that this person's getting a decrease in their food bolus as the day goes on with a higher carb ratio. And then the sensitivity is roughly the same and the target's in the same ballpark through the day. So that's just at face value looking at them. And actually, I see here someone who, OK, so this is the sensor and meter overview. So what we're seeing is the meter values, because this person's not using a sensor at the moment. And we can see the range of roughly around breakfast, has pretty great profile of blood sugars at that time of day, except sometimes they might look a little low, but really it looks great. And then there's a little bit of a rise to lunchtime, that's minor, and then more of a rise to dinner, and then even more of a rise by bedtime, or if he's got very high blood sugars before dinner, they get corrected down. But it gives the sense to me that there's a problem with bolus insulin, and that might be the carb ratio or the carb counting accuracy, but we know that the carb ratio is weakening as the day goes on, and it looks like that might be the wrong strategy. And the other way we can see that, even though to me it's fairly obvious from that plot in the large panel, the lower ones show the change overnight, then the change from before until 4 hours after each meal following in the breakfast, lunch, and dinner time periods of the day. You can kind of see this little bit of a rise as the day goes on. And then here we actually have sensor values, and the prominent thing is that every night there is a drop in the blood sugar. It might be from bolus, we're not sure, but most likely to be from basal because it's the overnight period. So even when he does not wake up low, you can see by morning around breakfast time, may not be low, he's still dropped overnight. And that some nights he starts out with a better sugar and he does end up low. And there's quite a few prolonged periods of low leading into the morning. So there's no mystery that if he's already having a dropping sugar, whether he's low or not, if he starts exercising, it's going to accentuate his risk for lows. So this person needs an overnight basal adjustment. So just look at another case. So maybe I won't get into the details of this, but the basals look fairly flat through the day. So I'd wonder, is there not enough in the dawn phenomenon hours, so he's struggling with morning sugars, or is there too much from noon to 5, the afternoon hours, that might lead to lows? And the rest of the stuff I think looks fairly stable. I'm having a little trouble seeing from here. Consistent carb ratio through the day and same sensitivity through the day. So he's using a sensor, so we don't expect to see so many blood sugars, but basically looks like he is struggling with morning blood sugars a bit, so maybe the dawn phenomenon's a problem. And in that lower left panel, you see overnight this sort of general rise, and that pre-dinner their levels are at their tightest, so maybe there is too much basal over the afternoon as well. So that's the sense I would get. But actually the sensor gives us a different story. The sensor shows that the systematic time of day that he's dropping is in the afternoon, following his lunch. And this really does highlight that issue of people being who are active, who have a flat basal programming, when most people for physiological insulin who are quite active are going to need their lowest amounts from noon to 5. And so that really highlighted it for us. Some of these are actually asymptomatic when reviewing with him. So the levels before dinner may seem fine, but he's actually gone for some hours with hypoglycemia. And then I'll just, actually this is going pretty well, I think.
Yeah, take your time with the cases.
So maybe on this one, I wanted to go through this sort of a systematic approach, because if someone's wearing a sensor, the first thing that you can see from a CareLink Pro download is this thing called the, well, actually I'll tell you about it in a moment, this therapy management dashboard. But I always need to, for my own obsessive compulsiveness, I need to see the parameters programmed first. So here is someone whose basal programming looks fairly flat through the day, 0.7, and then is that at noon 0.8? Can you, either of you see that? On the first basal profile on the left. So fairly flat through the day. There's a bit of a dawn phenomenon. I love seeing these visually, and in the old CareLink Personal, or the one we can use now, you get this image, which I'm just showing you here. So you can see that noon to 9 being higher, and then 3 to 9 a.m. being higher, and noon to 5 lower. So I like seeing that visual. But actually on these next outputs on CareLink Pro, we can see them. So actually here are her basal rates in the solid green line in that large panel. And we can see her systematic overlay of sensor values day by day over the course of about a week. So what do you notice? You notice actually pretty flat overnight sugars, and then this sort of gradual step up in blood sugars during the day. To me, this is a problem with bolus insulin primarily. Maybe there's too little basal through the day, but it doesn't follow that pattern where there's a reduction in the afternoon. So to me, this is a problem with bolus insulin. On the right, on the dashboard, we get a very quick view of how many sugars they're checking. She's checking a lot. Her average sugar and estimated A1C, and then knowledge about how often she's changing her sets and some of the adherence parameters. And then, to me, one of the most important things is this subtle little dotted green line in the large panel. Do you see the basal profile in the solid green line? Hovering below and above it is this variable line, dotted green line. That's estimating the amount of average insulin on board. So considering their active insulin time, how much bolus insulin is on board at those times. So now when I said her overnight looks fairly nice and flat and physiological, I can confirm that that's because of basal insulin being programmed well, because I can see around 1 a.m. we've got basically all the bolus insulin running out, level of 0 up until the morning around 6 a.m. or so. So I can know that those lines in the overnight period are actually basal assessments when there isn't insulin on board. So she's got great overnight basal, but she's struggling with this rise. And actually, she has a substantial fear of hypoglycemia, such that she continues to intentionally underrepresent her carbs through the day for fear of postprandial hypoglycemia. But her seeing this output is one thing that can help her overcome that fear, to sort of see that there is a systematic rise. Her risk of daytime hypoglycemia is negligible. And then what it does, actually, the second page of this dashboard gives an episode summary. She's not having hypoglycemia, that's her issue, it's hyperglycemia. It kind of shows when they're happening. So basically it's saying that they're happening after bolus doses. That's the main explanation in that little bar. The first bar in the graph on the right side is saying that she's struggling with post-bolus hyperglycemia. And so really the real focus here has to be evaluating her carb ratio and estimating carbs more accurately. So it kind of helps to do that. And on the page, I'm going to flip back to that last page. You know, if you're reviewing this in a clinical visit with a patient, you could sign it and date it, and this would be a very good kind of clinical intervention. And here, the next page, we're seeing her sensor values, her capillary glucose values. And the magic of this compared to the CareLink Personal is that when I see a low sugar, for example, or any sugar, I can connect it with the sugar beforehand. I can see if the hypoglycemias are kind of following corrections for highs, for example, as hers were. And then I see that same pattern of a rising sugar through the day, which the meal summaries show us in the lower panels. And then finally, I can look at day-by-day episodes. So if she told me this is the day I run, I can pull that up and I can look at the sensor reading. So that was my, the purpose of that was to kind of look at CareLink Pro in a little bit more detail. So let me conclude. I started out with new evidence around low glucose suspend. It's a new approach to help face the challenge of unpredictable lows, and it really makes sense in the context of an active patient. A diabetes healthcare provider can effectively initiate guidance for safe exercise by describing and implementing 5 steps. Are they acknowledging and working to reconcile their barriers to care? Do they have physiological insulin? Can they then coach them to estimate X carbs, coach them to adjust insulin, bolus and basal as we described, and then finally educate them around the effects of anaerobic and resistance exercise? And so a healthcare professional's knowledge of exercise physiology is fundamental to delivering those 5 steps. And that was Mike's contribution in this session. And then this CareLink downloads, they represent an efficient means to more confidently establish that step 2, which is the physiological insulin regimen. So I think I'll stop there and return it to Josh for moderating questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Reddell, do you have any comments about any of those cases? I know we went through them fairly quickly, but anything that you saw or would have commented on differently or independently?
No, I think that they told the story of the value of CareLink and how to analyze these things in different ways. I do have a basic question about if glucose levels seem to be steady but too high and it's hours after meal, should I really adjust my bolus in the last meal or should I change my basal? Yeah, like it seems to be steady, but it's at maybe 8.6, 8.7. Is that an adjustment for basal or for bolus?
Yeah, so obviously you can adjust whatever you would like and get great blood sugar control, but for the active patient, the real goal is for the basal to be physiological, and that means its goal is just to maintain a sugar wherever it is. Okay. Because if it helps to correct a consistent, systematic hyperglycemia after a certain meal, sometimes you see people's basal profiles and they're like programmed with a spike after each mealtime. You can tell they're using it to help correct hyperglycemia. The problem is if they're an active patient, the day that they're more active that day, it's a long training day, or someone who's not active gets sick and can't eat a meal, then they've got too much bolus. So I like to focus, it's too much basal. I like to focus the basal on maintaining a sugar
whatever
and not correcting it.
Okay, perfect.
It's the correction, the sensitivity that really should work to correct the high sugars.
Yeah. In terms of food, so I know that Dr. Riddell, you spoke to us about having quick-acting carbs during the exercise, but and both of you can comment on this either by personal experience or clinical experience. How much do you think the quality of the meal matters before exercise, after exercise, in terms of stability? I guess is the big question. So macronutrient distribution, food choice, and that sort of thing, or is it mostly just a carb and insulin balance?
Yeah, you and I have talked about this over the last 12 months or so. I think that for me, if you're being physically active, you need to have a carbohydrate-rich meal 3-4 hours before the event. You can get away with it if you don't do it, but if you do it again the next day, you're going to be compromised. So my belief is that you need that macronutrient mix about 55% carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I've noted that my glucose can be more stable if I go with a little bit higher protein in the diet on days that I'm not exercising really vigorously, really competitively. So it's something that we notice, I think, if we're using CGM, that a higher protein meal, a little bit less, especially the refined carbohydrates, you do seem to see better stability overnight too as well. Do you have any comments, Bruce, from?
Yeah, I would just say that kind of what we've talked about is how to supplement carbs for the purpose of maintaining blood glucose. But then there's the healthy diet that maintains a healthy lifestyle and healthy muscle and competitive sports or sports in general. Yeah. And to me, they're kind of separate issues. Like I do remember you gave a session with someone, I regret that I don't remember her name, gave a very sophisticated talk about the amount of carbs and macronutrients in the meals. And the amount of carbs was extraordinary, but it wasn't the carbs just for exercise. It was the carb for an endurance athlete who day by day needs to meet a certain caloric amount to maintain her weight and her level of physical activity.
Right.
But then what are the additional carbs we think about to maintain sugars through an activity and afterwards? And that's kind of what we focused on today.
Right, so for an Olympian, it could be 250 grams of carb in a day, but then if you're not an Olympian, you could probably get away with a third of that and still have very good stability.
And in terms of the overnight period, so I know we looked at perhaps people's increase in sensitivity, having that second dip overnight. Is there any evidence or even anecdotal evidence to show that eating something particularly before bed, even without insulin, so maybe a really slowly acting carb, for example, might counteract that to some extent?
Yes, there have been some studies showing that a mixed meal at bedtime, it's simple as a peanut butter sandwich that has some protein and some carbohydrate in it, seems to have a prolonged effect on glucose stability. And some products that have maltodextrin in it also do help. We know that from quite a few studies. The kids who have that quick carb snack at bedtime, I worry about them because it's kind of peaking and then it's disappearing, maybe when they're most vulnerable at 3 in the morning.
But I have to just say that clinically, when people exercise and have lows, that a lot of the time they have a dropping sugar overnight, whether they were exercising or not. And it's when we go back and evaluate that step 2, we find out they're dropping anyway. Yeah. So in other words, the exercise just helped to reveal a problem that already existed.
Right.
And so I'm not saying that people shouldn't eat after exercise. They should, and especially in the phase where they're adapting to getting into exercise, but it could end up being that they don't need so much extra carbs in the overnight period if their insulin was just more physiological.
Yeah, another example of that is you'll have parents or patients say, I always go high after exercise. I always go high. But then if you look at them on a sedentary day, they are not carb counting properly and they're going high anyway. Mm-hmm. It's a time effect, not necessarily an exercise effect. So it's really important, I think, to have, as Dr. Perkins says, a good analysis on a normal day first and get that titrated before you're adding in big changes because of exercise.
Yeah, no, all fantastic points. So I think we probably have time for one more question. So I'll address this to Dr. Riddell first. So if you have a patient with diabetes that comes to you, it's kind of like weekend warrior concept. So wants to be a beast activity on the weekend, maybe not so much otherwise. Any thoughts about how you might first strategize with them so that all hell doesn't break loose?
Well, you need to get a good handle on what sport they're doing and what time of day they're doing it. But if you have that information, for me, I think it's best to err on the side of having a little extra carbohydrate, a little extra X carbs on there, not doing too many insulin adjustments at first, But then if it begins to be a more consistent behavior, they have pattern adjustment changes that you could do on your basal insulin. So for example, on the weekend, if you switch to a pattern A on your pump and that automatically steps down your insulin by 50%, your basal insulin by 50%, an hour and a half before you're playing that sport, if it's consistent, then that can be really convenient for the individual.
Oh, that's excellent. Any comments, Dr.
Yeah, I would just say, like,
for
from the big picture context, the weekend warrior, what's their control like generally, like on the other 6 days of the week, other than the day that they're warrioring? Because if they're doing great, then maybe all we would want to do is err on the side of preventing hypoglycemia, because they have a great A1C. They should, even if they have terrible glycemia with that exercise. But the other thing in the big picture that we would always promote the regular exercise to meet the guidelines, which is exercise most days for a minimum of 30 minutes, ideally an hour, and mixing in resistance exercise so that this person has a higher level of fitness and conditioning to better manage physiologically the weekend warrior stuff and not end up with heart attacks over it.
Absolutely. Well, we are just about out of time here, so that brings us to the end of our webcast today. So thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Dr. Perkins. Thank you, Mike Riddell, for being here. It's been a wonderful, rich discussion this morning. Excellent presentations. Reminder to the audience that you can click on the resources tab, get the presentation, get the exercise and type 1 document that Dr. Riddell spoke of. Any follow-up questions, you can always email those in to us. And we'll look forward to your participation in future webcasts, hopefully not too many months away. And with that, I will bid everyone a good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.